Let's talk about section F, which is closing. F1 reads, closing, for purposes of this purchase contract, closing shall be the date when all appropriate conveyance documents are recorded in the Bureau of Conveyances of the state of Hawaii. F2, scheduled closing date. The scheduled closing date shall be, and it has a blank there. What I recommend that you put in F2 is a number of days from acceptance versus a hard date. Now, there are different reasons for why you would do each, and it's not a right or wrong so much as understanding the differences between the two. So let's say that on Oahu, on average, you can close something in 30 days. If you're on one of our other islands, it may take longer for a variety of different reasons. But let's say that we're using a 30-day mark as an example. You would indicate that the scheduled closing date shall be 30 days from acceptance. What we've also inserted and recommended by speaking to our counsel is to put in there 30 days from acceptance and conveyed vacant, or to be delivered vacant, and to be delivered vacant. So you want to add that entire thing in there, because this is also assuming that this is for the purpose of a primary residence and you do intend to occupy it, or have the buyer occupy it. If it's already rented out and leased out and it's tenant occupied and the buyer knows this and is okay with this, then clearly you wouldn't put that language in there. This is also important. If the scheduled closing date falls on the day the Bureau of Conveyances is closed, so this could be a weekend or a holiday, closing will be the next day when conveyance documents can be recorded. That's really important to understand. Sometimes people put extra words and language in there, but if you understand the purchase contract and read it, it might already address that issue, and it's not needed to add extra words in section Q. F3, which is change to the scheduled closing date. This happens from time to time. So what this says is choose paragraph F3A or F3B. So not both, but or. F3A, one-time unilateral right to extend. So what a unilateral is, and this came about, this language changed in May 2019. Previous to that, it was a bilateral. Bilateral means both parties have to agree. Unilateral means one party. So either the buyer or the seller, whatever day, if this is checked here, F3A is checked, and you have a certain number of days that's inserted here, let's pretend it's 10 days, that either side can make that decision to activate the additional 10 days. So I'm going to read it to you. Either party may extend the scheduled closing date up to blank days by delivery of written notice to the other party prior to the scheduled closing date. Once either party has exercised this unilateral right to extend, for all or any part of the extension period set forth above, time shall be of the essence, and there shall be no further unilateral right to extend by either party. The scheduled closing date may not be further extended unless buyer and seller agree in writing. This provision relates to the extension of the scheduled closing date, and timeframes measured from the scheduled closing date shall be measured from the extended scheduled closing date. So what this means is if there's 10 days in there as an example and the buyer needs it, they can use 1 day or 10 days. They have the right to do that without the seller's permission. Know that it's a double-edged sword, that the seller could also use 1 or 10 days or anything in between without asking permission to the buyer. Where this becomes a little tricky is if you are working with the buyer and there is a lock that is expiring, a lock meaning that the buyer has financing and their lock's going to expire and they absolutely need to close by a certain date, and the seller now uses that entire amount that will be indicated here, 10 days for instance, that could really screw things up for the buyer in terms of their lock and their lock extension. Who's going to pay for that? The seller's not required to pay for that. So that becomes a point of contention or even renegotiation. The other part of it too, which it says in here, is let's say there's 10 days that's indicated here and one or either party used 1 day. It doesn't mean that there's 9 days remaining. It means that if you used 1 day or 3 days or 10 days, that entire provision is now gone. And it switches from this to this. And so let's read this part of it. F3B is time is of the essence. Time is of the essence, and the scheduled closing date may not be extended unless buyer and seller agree in writing. So if you chose this option simply means there is no extension from either side unless we both agree on it. Again, this is not a right or wrong. This is just kind of a safety measure, but you have to realize that if you are trying to protect the buyer, and you select this to say, hey, I'm going to close in 30 days, but just in case I can't, I want to have an extra 7 days or 10 days or whatever that looks like to be inserted in here. Just know that double-edged sword, which means that the seller could also use it to extend, which removes your ability to use it to extend at all, exists. So you have to understand that. The other thing I'll note to you as well is there are other firms' addenda, their own standard addenda, that they insert language that basically says things, which changes this whole paragraph, because what it says is if one party uses a certain amount of days, so in this case, let's call it 10 days is what it indicates here. And if one party uses 5 days, it says in there that the other party may use an additional 5 days. So it keeps whatever is remaining alive, so to speak, as opposed to switching it to time is of the essence. So you really, really have to read other firms' addenda to understand if it alters or amends the purchase contract. Moving on to F3B is that simply is like you have to create an amendment agreed upon by both parties to extend it beyond any date that's indicated here in F2. F4 escrow, this transaction shall be escrowed by the escrow company, and all the information is here. Here's the important thing, and I see this often, is do not put seller's choice, do not put TBD or to be determined. The reason is that doesn't have a measure of when that's going to happen. That's just being lazy. Just put the title and escrow company in there. If the seller hasn't indicated what they would like to have for title and escrow in the MLS, just call them and ask. If you can't get a hold of them or they don't care, just put whoever you recommend. If they want to counter and change that, then they'll send to you a counter. But don't put seller's choice, don't put TBD, because to be determined when. You can default on the contract by putting something like that, because I understand the intent is just to try to get something submitted and get it moving right away. But without a time frame, to be determined when by seller within 3 days, that's different. That at least has a time frame on it. But most often I see seller's choice or TBD, which is kind of a lazy way to go about it. F5, prorations and closing adjustments. Based on the 30-day proration, escrow shall prorate the following, if applicable, as of the date of closing, which is very normal: real property tax, lease rents, interest on assumed obligations, mortgage and other insurance premium, tenant rents, maintenance, private sewer, marina and or association fees, and blank. And what I would typically put is just put none other. So just to make clear that it is only applicable to the things that are normal, which they've indicated up here, but nothing else beyond that. F6, closing costs. This just separates the split in costs as typical in our market and in our state. So if anything that you want to have the buyer pay for that's unusual, or the seller to pay for that's typically out of the ordinary in our market, then you would need to indicate it as such in section Q. And some of those things that, for instance, could be if it's a heavy seller's market, the buyer could pay for all the seller's closing costs, which is this portion of it. And if you want to do that, then you would need to indicate it as such in section Q as an example. F7, notice of conveyance tax. This section is basically referring to if the buyer will be occupying as their primary residence or not. That's the main thing. So you're going to just click here if they intend to occupy, and loans like FHA, VA, USDA are owner-occupied loans only. So if that is a type of financing, this would have to be the case, because those type of loans are not available for investment. Other than principal residence, could be a conventional loan that's non-owner occupied, could be all cash. And then this here is just a number of days in which you're going to notify the other side of to escrow to give them information that they're going to need. F8, which is assessments. An assessment is defined as any obligation, not including prorations and closing adjustments as indicated in paragraph F5, levied against the property by a homeowners association, governmental body, and any other entity with a legal right to assess. Assessments, if any, shall be charged as follows. And A goes on to say any lump sum assessments levied against a property prior to the acceptance date shall be paid by either seller or buyer. And any exceptions, we recommend putting seller, and the exceptions are none. Now, you could change this if you are already aware that there's an assessment. Sometimes you're going in to purchase a property, and on the MLS or by speaking to the listing agent, they tell you, yes, there's an assessment for, let's say it's a condo, there's an assessment of $300 per month. That's going to be going on for the next 3 years to pay for a new elevator, as an example. If you already know that, then you're going to want to make sure that you indicate it as such too. You don't want to write an offer with bad intention. So if it's okay with the buyer and they understand that and they're well informed of that, then you can adjust this accordingly. F8B, any assessments levied against the property prior to the acceptance date, which are being paid in installments, shall be paid by either seller or prorated. As of the closing date, exceptions, and you can also put none as well. And it goes on to C, if a new assessment is authorized against the property between the acceptance and scheduled closing date, seller shall make appropriate disclosure under paragraph I2, which is an amended seller disclosure, and such assessment shall be paid as buyer and seller shall agree. If buyer and seller cannot reach an agreement within 5 days of both parties being aware of this new assessment, unless buyer has agreed to pay that or assume that assessment, either party may elect to terminate this purchase contract pursuant to paragraph 03. So that's if you've already gone into, you've already written an offer, opened up escrow, and while in escrow, there's a new assessment that is unbeknownst to either party. This is when section C is applicable to that. F9 is consents. Buyer and seller may be required to obtain consents for lessors, homeowner or condominium associations, co-op boards, existing lenders, vendors, and other entities. Buyer or seller shall cooperate and take all reasonable action to obtain such consents. F10, risk of loss. Risk of loss passes to buyer upon closing or buyer's possession of the property, whichever occurs sooner. This is really important to understand as well, because there are some circumstances where the buyer and or the buyer's agent may be rushing to get possession of the property, which is an early occupancy. So risk of loss, it passes upon buyer's possession of the property or whichever occurs first. So know that that's important to understand. F3, possession. Seller shall give. Shall versus may is a big, important legal word. Shall means they absolutely must. Seller shall give a buyer possession of the property at closing. And then finally, F12, which is keys to the property. Seller at seller's sole cost and expense shall provide buyer at closing with all existing, but at least one set of functioning keys controls for entry, interior, mailbox, pool, security, parking area, and all garage door openers. And buyer shall pay all fees and or deposits which may be required for any of these items, unless buyer and seller agree otherwise. All key controls, garage door openers shall be released to the buyer only after escrow has verbally notified all parties and their brokerage firms that closing has occurred. It is strongly recommended that buyer rekey entry door locks and reprogram garage door openers upon change of ownership. So remember I mentioned before, they only need to give one set of keys. If you need extra keys or you want the seller to pay for some of the things like the fobs or whatever it is, you can't assume that that's the case. The contract says otherwise. So anything that's different than what the boilerplate wording is, it needs to be adjusted in section Q or in an addendum or something to that effect. So know that that's the case, and this is section F.